USA History Guide. So what caused the American Revolution? Everything was different after the French and Indian War. For one, there was no more big threat to fear. For the colonists, the French were gone. They no longer needed the protection from the English. But the mindset of the American soldiers had also changed. Many of them had never traveled so far from home. A new nationalistic perspective was beginning to emerge. More than that, they had fought alongside their British countrymen, and the American colonists started to realize they were a lot different than those guys wearing red coats. The British leaders didn't appreciate the volunteers of the colonies. They were more crass in nature. They weren't as puritanical. There was harsh language and treatment, and that didn't go over well. But the biggest changes happened when the British started trying to get the money back they had spent on a very costly international war. The British leadership figured if they were going to put all this money into getting rid of the French, that they should get some of it back. The easiest way to do that? Tax revenues. So by 1764, when it was time to raise money, Chancellor George Grenville decided to pass the Sugar Act. I mean, the Sugar Act wasn't really such a startling thing. As a matter of fact, it was cheaper than the old law that had been on the books, but the colonists just didn't like the idea of having strict tax enforcement. Tax officials were brought in to monitor the exchanges. Merchants were hurt by this. Obviously, anybody who was smuggling or doing illegal things was now getting caught. So the colonists went to the power of the masses and they boycotted. The boycotts were effective, and by 1765 the Sugar Act was gone and now the Stamp Act came in. The Stamp Act required the purchase of a special paper that was used for many common items, from playing cards to legal documents, your papers to get on ships, insurance policies, you name it. If you had to transact business, you needed paper, and you had to have a certain kind of paper. The British hoped to make money off of this system. But the colonists weren't doing so well. It was a time of economic stagnation. There was unemployment, high inflation, and overall poverty. James Otis, not one of the more famous names when it comes to founding fathers, was very instrumental at this time. He is the famous guy who coined the phrase, "no taxation without representation." The idea being, if the British were going to tax the colonists, then the colonists should have direct representation, not virtual representation, in the British Parliament. So in such a time of uncertainty, it's not surprising that the colonists started to protest, and eventually that turned into boycotts. The tax officials were being chased away, sometimes literally, and there was too much pressure to keep the Stamp Act going for too long. By the end of 1765, the Stamp Act was pretty much useless because the British couldn't enforce it because all of their stamp distributors kept resigning or running away. There was an overall strategy among the colonists of a non-importation movement. Basically, we're not going to bring in British goods if you're going to make money on it. Long story short, these were pretty effective. Into the 1760s, British imports were down 40%, or a really significant number. So by 1766, the British Parliament passed a Declaratory Act saying the Stamp Act was repealed. Woohoo! But, oh, by the way, at the same time, they are asserting all of their authority once and for all, so you better not try anything else. Into 1767, and we have a new British Prime Minister named Charles Townshend, who replaced William Pitt, who was ailing. The Townshend Revenue Acts would be passed, bringing even more restrictions on the colonists, and the resistance spread from the cities into the countryside. The common battle cry was, "Save your money and save your country." The Townshend Revenue Acts put taxes on all kinds of things: lead, glass, paint, paper, tea, you name it. It was basically a tax on goods. A lot of the money being raised from these goods was being used to pay the royal officials in America, so it wasn't even so much about paying off debt anymore, and the tension was building. But more pressure was brought to bear, and the Townshend Revenue Acts were also repealed on the day of the Boston Massacre. Into October of 1768, now the British are stationing troops in cities. Boston and New York are the most famous. One British soldier was stationed at the Customs House in Boston in 1770, and a crowd formed and started taunting him, calling him a damned rascally scoundrel lobster. Creative names. They called him other things too that aren't suitable for here. The soldier's captain and some other soldiers showed up. The crowd started firing snowballs and rocks. Somebody fired a shot. People died, and it was bad news. Boston engraver Paul Revere portrayed the scene as a bunch of unarmed colonists being fired upon by the evil British soldiers. But eventually the Revenue Acts were repealed, and things calmed down a little bit until 1773, when the Tea Act was passed. Tea was a big deal. The British relied heavily on the East India Company to keep them afloat in India, and their main commodity was tea. And when the American colonists refused to buy tea, that severely damaged the British economy. It almost became synonymous that if you purchased tea from the British, you were an enemy of your country, you were a traitor. So when those ships pulled into the harbor with their tea shipments in 1773, there was gonna be a problem. The Boston Tea Party might sound like a mild name, but it was pretty intense. 45 tons of tea were dumped into the harbor. Ships were burned. Even in Annapolis and in New York, there was arson, as $3 million in modern day money was done in property damage. Retaliation by the British was swift. In 1774, they passed the Coercive Acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, and this started to eliminate even the most basic levels of self-government. These punitive measures against Massachusetts said that ships could not even be loaded in Boston Harbor until the East India Company was all paid back. Their colonial charter was annulled, they weren't even allowed to have meetings anymore, and when they did have meetings, the agenda was set, the royal governors were controlled by the king. At the same time, the Quartering Act was passed, making it okay for British soldiers to stay not only in public dwellings, but even in private dwellings at the owner's expense. Finally, the Quebec Act was established, which was the British government establishing a new rule in the territory they claimed from France after the 7 Years' War. This new royal government was authoritarian and anti-republican, and it also recognized the Roman Catholic Church, and it allowed them to basically be established as a state religion. This created great fear among the colonists. And the First Continental Congress would soon be formed. So to recap, here's the basic pattern. The British started with taxes, that led to occupation, soon led to the elimination of self-government, and potentially even religious persecution, which was why many of the colonists and their families had come to America in the first place. So it was no surprise that revolution was just around the corner. Subscribe and check back for new videos and the American Revolution coming soon.